Ms. Flick, ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to be here again in this new building. The panel fits very nicely and picks up on the presentation we've just heard. We're talking here about global challenges and international cooperation. Do we need this? And if so, what form should they take? Do we perhaps need different forms of cooperation? This is a very broad topic, and we'd like to reflect the current situation, the current crisis, which I believe, if we consider people who didn't believe in globalization, but now they realize that we are. We are very much globalized. And here you can see the bat, this was a bat in China, which got the virus rolling. And this is something that has changed all of our lives, as well as all of the lives of people on all 5 continents. That's exactly what globalization is all about. In other words, you have interaction and interdependence across the borders and continents. Not only the bat in China, but the fact that people travel, we have international trade, and people say it is the growing population, and we see that people are interfering with nature, climate change. These are all problems which are global problems and global challenges. So the question is, how are we going to reply to this? In politics, you like to hear global problems require global responses or global action. That's what we often hear. But of course, you could also ask, is this something that always works? And you discussed that in detail when you talked about global trade. Is that always the right answer? And what does it mean if you have a polar case of global trade? We talk about the world government as a solution to all sorts of different problems, or a replacement. We can talk about the EU, for example. Is that the reply that we need? That's what we want to talk about. Now we have a wonderful panel, and I'd like to ask the members of the panel to come up on the stage in alphabetical order. We have Dr. Corinne Flick, and she is not primarily here in her role as hostess today, but she's here as a representative of an organization in civil society, as chair of CONVOCO. Then we have Professor Rupprecht Podszun, who is the chair of civil law, German and European competitive law at the University of Düsseldorf, as well as director of the Institute for Antitrust Law. Nice that you're with us, too. Then I'd like to ask Professor Herbert Reitsamer to come up on stage. He is the head of the hospital here at the University Hospital here in Salzburg. He is a neuro and sensory physiologist. He's also a member of the Hospital Council for the Republic of Austria. So, of course, this is a very important position here in our health crisis. And then, of course, Dr. Peter Wittig. He's the former German ambassador in London and in Washington. So welcome to you, too. And I'm going to come and sit with you as well. So this is a panel which I hope will make a brief introduction and also quick answers to the questions, because we're under a bit of pressure time-wise. So I'd like to begin with you, Mr. Reitsamer. You have a lot of experience in international cooperation. You were a physician abroad, and now in this crisis, you have told me that you have also flown patients in from other countries that had problems with hospital capacity. My question to you, therefore, is, what was your experience during this crisis? Did you have the impression that there is some type of international institution that is lacking, and, for example, to see to it that hospital capacity can be used cross-border? Or was it more a question of your having the impression that the problems that you had here with the local players? So if it was more a question of the initiative taken by local players, is that the way it should be? Or have you learned from the crisis? Could you say that we need new alliances that we've just referred to, perhaps a European Health Agency? What would you like to see? What has your experience been? Well, you want a quick answer to that? Yeah, very quick and to the point. Well, this crisis was more than we could all handle. What we did see was that after the primary panic at the beginning, where everyone went undercover, so to speak, then we saw that there was a great deal of solidarity, an exchange of information and different models, which would show the number of hospital beds and ventilators that are available. These were taken from the data in Wuhan or in Bergamo in northern Italy. So we extracted this information from their data. This was very open communication. Now, the healthcare systems are differently organized in different countries. In Austria, when it comes to restrictions of movement, and we saw that the situation is similar to that in Germany, and implementation of the health policy at a municipal level. Then we had higher level institutions, the Robert Koch Institute that issued guidelines, and the Centers of Disease Control with a similar role, and then these were then broken down to a more local level. So I don't think it's all that bad. When it comes to local implementation, the situations vary considerably. Think, for example, urban areas and rural areas, mountainous areas, where there are people who are really have a hard time getting to a city. And one effect of that is telemedicine. This has been expanded considerably. We could advise people without them having to come into the city. But what we would like would be to have improved cooperation and improved communication. And in particular, we would also like to see more empowerment. In other words, for medical care. This is very different from one European country to the next. 8 ventilators for 100,000 in the UK. You might have up to 35 or 40 in Austria and Germany. Thank you very much. Mr. Wittig, let me talk about the state perspective here. In the crisis, we've had the impression that cooperation worked okay, but they say that China didn't report the results until a bit late. And in the WHO, for example, it didn't really work as it should have. And the EU was accused of failing completely at the beginning. How do you see that based on your experience as a diplomat? Are we being too strict, or is this justified? Well, there were two contradictory trends here. First of all, we had a reflex to cut oneself off nationally, and then at the same time, there was the desire to have international and to fight this international pandemic internationally. For example, when it came to health policy and amongst research workers. We have both of these phenomena at the same time. They coexist. Now, if you take a look at the EU, first of all, isolation, for example, export controls for medical goods, and then certain borders that were closed. And the EU was in a state of shock for many weeks. Nothing happened for many weeks. And we have to be fair and say that when it comes to health policy, the EU doesn't have all that many competences. It took time, and then at some point in time, it was clear that we could procure things together for PPE, for example, protective personal equipment, and then we saw that it was very important when it came to the follow-on effects of the pandemic. There was a learning process, a learning curve, and the EU developed here. Internationally here, the WHO was what was focused on, and this is a more technical or technocratic organization with lots of medical expertise for advisory services, if you like, for the southern countries in the global system, and then these were underfunded. This was politicized, and the Americans saw this as being friendly towards China. Maybe it's not all that wrong, this criticism, but this was not an organization that could really intervene. So there was no element of a world government, if you want to put it that way. And then the WHO then became the litmus test, and we also see the current president. The U.S. decided to leave the organization, and that contrasts to Obama, who was very much in a leadership position when fighting Ebola. The United States was in a totally different position back then. So focusing on the WHO, I don't think you can say that a world government in healthcare is going to be the case in the future as a result of this pandemic, but international institutions will be dealing with this, especially in the follow-on effects. The North-South conflict will become even more dramatic, both nationally as well. You also see the social divide is becoming even stronger as a result of corona. The international organizations, the G20, the United Nations, the World Bank, they will also have a lot of work following the pandemic. It will be a test to see how strong international cooperation will be. You indicated that Trump played a role here as an individual, and you're very familiar with the UK as well. So to what extent could you say that individuals can influence politics? You have the impression that Boris Johnson at the beginning said, well, let's try natural or herd immunity. He was rather relaxed at the beginning, and then at some point in time it became clear to him that that was the wrong approach. So is it true that individuals, when it comes to such an important matter, that individuals can really define the approach, or is the strictures in these countries that are independent of the individuals? Well, personalities do play a role. Heads of government or presidents have played a very important role here. And those who are in campaign mode, for example, the current U.S. president, as well as the prime minister in the UK, who was just exiting a campaign, the Brexit campaign, and as a result of this campaign mode, they never even left the campaign mode. Trump never stopped his campaign mode. So they came up with a poorer performance. If you think of other politicians, for example, down-to-earth politicians, for example, the chancellor in Germany is the best example. They were led by scientific advice, and at the beginning, we can see that this showed that there is a systematic, rational reply. And these types of politicians were more successful. I think that is something that we can say. That's something you like to hear as a scientist. If advice from scientists is useful, that's something we like to hear. Ms. Flick, we can see a certain failure on the part of the government, suboptimal replies. So is there a role to be played for organizations in civil society in this type of crisis in order to come up with an answer to these problems? Do politics need civil societies that can mobilize the public and get cooperation moving and call on them for cooperation, as well as ethical behavior? So the question to you as the head of an organization in civil society, you don't conduct campaigns, but you are active on an international level. What did you think when this crisis came about? And what were your ideas about the role of CONVOCO and the consequence for the work of your organization? Well, the answer is yes. This organization is very important. If you don't refer to CONVOCO, let's refer to the very beginning when we talk about the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Here we can see that foundations build bridges between the different sectors. In other words, between the public sector, the private sector, and science. And if you have to act quickly and without any red tape, that's what we need. And this is something that a foundation can do much more quickly and without considering the fact that you have the best, you can get the best research workers to come together. Countries cannot do that because there might be rivalries. So I think building bridges, this role is very important, and that's what we've seen now in this crisis, and we have to be grateful for this. My CONVOCO Foundation, a smaller foundation, when the crisis arrived, I decided that CONVOCO's voice should be heard. We started podcasts, something we hadn't done before March. And since March, we've had 19 live podcasts. We've produced even more. So I think that if, as I said in my presentation earlier on, if we can't help and make a contribution, when can we do it? We discussed this for 2 days. You're here. Lots of others are here up front as well, representatives from the economy, from science. We spent a couple of days together, and we've talked about where the world is headed, where are we right now, how are we going to deal with the pandemic and all the differences and the different changes. And I think it's all very important, yes. So maybe we'll come back to that in just a minute when we talk about the interaction between NGOs and civil society and government. But I'd like to ask you, Mr. Podszun, now, on a different point. This crisis, you are an expert in anti-competition law and civil law, and you deal with intellectual property. And this is also something that plays a very important role internationally. And we know that now, that hundreds of companies are now competing to find medication and vaccines. So now the question is, when we talk about international cooperation, how is this going to work? Is this something where some company will come up with the vaccine, or maybe more than one company will apply for a patent, and then the vaccine will be sold? We have the impression that there's going to be a certain constraint that intellectual property will have to be made available and will not be something that will have a monopoly, be sold at the price of a monopoly, which would mean then that something that we see in Western Europe and in the United States, we focus on the importance of intellectual property. Maybe in this crisis, this is something that would be suspended. How do we have to imagine that? Maybe only the first vaccine will be made available free of charge, or at least the intellectual property, and then others, then we can return back to the capitalistic pharmaceutical industry, where you would see that this would focus more on profit. How would you see that?
First, a comment to your question, because I believe this is very interesting, because you focus on what is important in this pandemic, economy and ecology. You see, we were talking about political institutions and other institutions. I think in this respect we have to bear in mind, particularly when looking at international networks, here we are listening or hearing companies, experts, scientists, who are now in the focus and who are now in a position to organize this cooperation. And I'm sure you know this better than I do, making sure that the international cooperation really works out without the Austrian government handing out any forms which everyone has to fill in. So things are supposed to work out. And I believe this is the very important point. Now, intellectual property, this is something which we've always considered to be important in the past. And the crisis, with all its negative and positive repercussions, show what the situation is, i.e. the crisis makes us think about things, see them in a clearer way. We want companies to do this or that, and of course they must be interested so that they can make profit. So this is the incentive of patent law. This is something which we really want to exploit. But at the same time, over the last 20 years, I can say that we have also seen where we have problems with, say, intellectual property. In the telecommunication industry, for instance, here you've got kind of patents which only have a local effect. And this means we have an obstacle to innovations which we want to have on the other hand. And I believe, I don't know how this will work out at the end of the day. And, this is how I implied when hearing your question, talking about the vaccines, talking about the drugs, this is something which we do not know. We do not know how all this will be developed or published. This in the context of intellectual property, I don't know. We also have to take into account who is producing what are the distribution channels, how can things be dealt with. And then at the end of the day, that we will see a trend with regard to intellectual properties, that there are certain mechanisms, certain exceptions have to be taken into account, and they will then be used. Just think about, making or getting debts, and then the extent of everything might be much different from what we have stipulated in our legislation or law. I'm not really very, very worried that there won't be any problems. But could you explain, what you mean? Well, think about a situation like this. We've got these test cases, HIV, drugs, that is in the past, and states try to produce drugs, and we know this from the Indian generic markets. They always try to use certain patents, and then of course there are other mechanisms which can be used to say you can do this or that under this or that condition. It is my hope that things will not develop so far, because before things start like this, you might be able to solve things using negotiations, proceedings or legal action. This is not really something which we want. Just think, this is something which we've done, or this might take about 10 years until the federal court might come up with a judgment or a sentence. So it really might take some time, and maybe this is not really what we want to have, but we might have the round table and thumb screws, money, and there might be other mechanisms which might be used to find a solution. Just one more supplementary question. Look at the government. The federal government, for instance, took part in several actions. How do you see this? Do you think it really makes sense? The wire card thing, what shall the government do? Get it under its control, then, releasing it the patents, or what do you think? It's almost like an economic battle. Well, you are closer to Mrs. Merkel than I am. Maybe you can find a better answer than I could do. But nevertheless, what I want to say is that we've got this Janus-faced situation, this double-faced situation. On the one hand, we want international cooperation, and we see it is not possible to do without, but nevertheless, we also fall back to the nationalistic way of thinking. And of course, just think about it. And you said, who will get the first 100,000 doses of such a vaccine? Surely there will be a fight, when it comes to distributing such vaccines. And if doses or the number of doses is limited, then of course we hope that we will be the ones receiving these doses. But in other cases or in other conflicts, like in Mediterranean or in South America or in Asia, there are also people who need these vaccines. There will be conflicts of distribution. And I'm sure our government has to do something. Here in Austria, Mr. Reitsamer, you also were thinking along similar lines. How can you get the vaccines and how can you get the drugs? I don't know whether you can talk about this. What is the Austrian strategy so that you are not at the end of the queue? Is this an issue you discuss in your committee? Brief answer, this is not an issue. In Austria, we have a relatively small pharmaceutical industry, but I'm very much convinced that lots of things will be dissolved sitting around the table. whoever will be able to, say, produce and launch, market such a vaccine can write or say, I am the company who saved the world. And I think this is an attribute which will certainly, pay off in the future, which will certainly have a positive effect on the operations of such a company. I believe the problems we will face are logistics problems. The costs countries have incurred, relate to the vaccines. Countries ordered them. Hundreds of thousands of millions of say, dollars have been spent already, although they do not know yet whether they will really get the vaccines. After we have vaccinated several hundreds of patients, then we will see how things will work. Now, if we get things, then of course all the distribution channels should work. Vaccines, so you ordered vaccines which does not yet exist? Well, yes, it exists, but it has not been tested. We do not know about side effects. But if this is the drug or the vaccine, which is very good also in terms of side effects, then at least Germany and France will get about 200 million doses. United States, 300 million doses ordered. I don't know which ones, but this is the strategy governments follow. You just order to have everything on stock. But I believe what is more important these days is that we do not lose sight of the fact that things are still ongoing and that it will take some time until such a vaccine will be around. And in the meantime, we'll still see a worsening, a deterioration of the pandemic. It is the health system which stands between us and the virus when it comes to handling everything, getting everything under control. And after the first phase, everyone checked everything, how things are developing. People start to take cover, and then suddenly the prophets emerged, surfaced, and they found out what's the best thing to do. And then, of course, in China, for instance, you see, they were able to build a hospital within 1 week. So, it's all about savings and health system. Maybe we should place our bets on such reactive behaviors or responses. So I think this is, one strategy. What we've seen, comparing ourselves with others, we have seen what are or where are the good health systems, where are the less good or less effective health systems. In the United States, we have an excess mortality of 100%. South American states, the mortality rate has been lowered by 1 year. In Sweden, we have a waiting time of 16 months. That is to get a place in, say, an old age pensioner's home. Now it's only 6 or 7 weeks. So you might say this is good news, but in principle, of course, this is not good news. Well, a cynical person would see things like this. I can only say that there are dramatic repercussions and consequences. I want to underline this because there's the criticism that all this is an inflated flu, it's not so bad, and you can say this is not the case. And of course we are lucky. This system is like a clockwork. It is not mutating. It's really keen on mutations, and it is very well foreseeable. So if we've got so and so many infected people today, then this means I will have so and so many patients in the ICU, and I need so and so many ventilators. So this means you can really control resources and capacities. Now this is a finding, this is an understanding which we concluded. So we had scientists concluding the respective effects, and this means we can now plan everything very well. It's not necessary to shut down everything. Just imagine during lockdown we just postponed lots and lots of operations, which of course affects the health of many people. Now we can say that it takes a few days until we need a resource. This means the hospital can work during these days, and then we can change to this emergency operation very quickly. I believe this really sounds like it is the right of the stronger one when it comes to accessing or getting access to vaccines or drugs. You know, the breathing masks, I think this happened in the early phases of the pandemic. You know, the powerful countries or those which were faster were able to get their hands on whatever they needed. So what do you think? Don't you think we need some more preparation, which is based on rules, you know, anticipating future pandemics? Or do you say we can't plan things, it's not plannable, we just have to go forward? And now, again, we have the major or the larger countries trying to reserve these vaccines for themselves. You know, even in the EU, we didn't really think about things that happened. You know, we've got 80 million doses in Germany, none in Italy. So don't you think that this is a problem? You know, don't you think we have to rethink in the EU as well how to handle a situation like this? Are there any chances, opportunities? Well, I believe as a result of this lessons learned process, meaning as soon as the pandemic reaches its, say, end, then I'm sure the EU will be in a position to prepare for the next pandemic. And, you know, this means there might be respective institutions working with that. In global terms, I don't think that there will be a body, a committee, which will have worldwide competencies, because at present we see that nationalisms are still very, very powerful. So a solidarity and value-based society, it didn't really work in the beginning, but this society, or this community rather, really learned that they will be successful only if they cooperate in times of a pandemic. So I'm more or less optimistic. Globally, I see a lot of distortions which we will face, particularly in the global south, because you do not know how the situation will develop in India, for instance, but Africa, you know, another continent of which we do not know where they are heading, what the development will be. So, and based on this, we will see whether or not global structures can emerge. This is something I can see.
Ms. Flick, the global structures won't be here all that quickly. But if we take a look at the role played by NGOs, for instance, and they then do they have the role of replacing the nation state, or are they going to be looking for more cooperation? And maybe my question then would be, you talked about different foundations, the Gates Foundation. Is it legitimate for a foundation to be so powerful and to maybe decide who's going to get the vaccine and what will be, where research will be conducted? Well, we certainly cannot replace countries. I don't think anybody wants that. I don't think any foundation wants to replace states. If I think about NGOs and foundations, I see them as bridge builders. They give assistance to the state, allow them to come closer to the civil societies and to listen to them. And so I think that this, too, is also interesting for governments to know what the NGOs are thinking, because they represent a large share of the population. The problem is funding for the NGOs, because if they can also fund the interests and the direction things take, we must not lose sight of that. But nonetheless, there will not be something that is free of different interests. Anything will be funded. We saw that in the WHO as well. So neutrality does not exist, full stop. Legitimacy, if you take a legal view of this, it's just the same in small foundations as in large foundations like Bill Gates. And as long as we are not involved in sovereign tasks, then they have the legitimacy. They pursue a certain purpose. Now, the new phenomenon, if we have large, rich foundations with lots of wealth, for example, the Gates Foundation, or maybe another one, this is something that we didn't even have, let's say, 15 years ago. They didn't have the levers that they have today. So I think you also have to see this in the long term. We have to think about whether we might need additional controls, which are there in the law, but maybe we have to consider this. And this is something that we will see over time. And we will also invite you to ask questions or make your comments also very briefly, please. But I have one more question for you, Mr. Podszun. I don't know if you advise pharmaceutical companies, for example, if they're thinking about whether to apply for a patent or certain intellectual property rights. How would you advise a company? There are a number of different strategies. A company might say they might commit to hand over their rights. They say, we'll only research for the general, in the general interest, and you could say from the very beginning that they would not be filing for patents, but you could do things differently. And you were right when you said a minute ago, research needs funds. They enter into risk. Some companies won't benefit at all, and if you don't get any results. So what would you advise a company? Maybe it's a rather general question, but I'd like to know how you would approach this type of question. Well, I'd like to see the time when a pharmaceutical company says they will renounce patents. That, to me, is something that they cannot do, because this patent world, they also have to think about the others excluding them. Other companies will rule them out. They talk about blocking patents. So just to be able to have my freedom to operate so that I can act, I then have to play this patent game. Otherwise, I, as a big company, will be there and you'll say, you cannot use your invention because I made the same invention, I applied for a patent and got a patent for it. So this is the situation we're in. The question is, how do you make use of your patents? And in the pharmaceutical industry, I think we are in an industry which is very committed to intellectual property more than in other sectors. For example, you have open source solutions in other areas, open cooperation, and this is much more disseminated. And in the digital sector as well, you can see all sorts of different strategies. You've got open systems where the interfaces are disclosed and everyone is invited to participate and to work on this. Then we have proprietary systems. Apple is a very good example of that, and they try to hold on to everything and keep that in their world, so to speak. And if we talk about these questions, then you can see that patent law is found in all sorts of different sectors. So this is great for legal experts. There's something that can be broken down in every different area. But when we see this from the state point of view, then you'll see that if we want to make any changes, then we might not solve one crisis, but we'll also be setting the benchmark for other areas as well. And in fighting the pandemic and dealing with foundations, when we talk about artificial intelligence tomorrow or digitization or who has a control over technology, are we going to control who can use certain platforms, etc. So I think the pharmaceutical industry, well, I think they have very good insight. They have a very major interest. They have the same interest. In other words, we know what we want. In other areas, it's much more difficult. I have greater concerns there. I'd also like to say something on what was said before, that Germany might have the vaccine and Italy does not. Well, that cannot be what it's all about. Or don't the Germans want to go to Italy, for example? So I think would that mean then that we need to consider solidarity and a just distribution? Yes, that'll be difficult if you want to go on vacation, for example. It's not feasible. The virus doesn't stop at borders, as we've heard before. Mr. Reitsamer. When we talk about patent law, of course, this will require billions. Billions have been put into research. So, of course, certain things are included in the contracts. If they are successful, then, of course, how it will be dealt with in patent law. And then we'll have to ask that question again at the national level, patents, for example. I'd like to thank all of you, and for you for your questions and comments as well.